Few people knew that behind the smiles, music, and worldwide fame, George Harrison carried a deep resentment toward one man that lasted for years. It wasn't just a simple disagreement. It became a painful conflict shaped by betrayal, creative battles, and personal wounds that never fully healed. But who earned the title of the person George Harrison seemed to dislike more than anyone, and what really happened behind the scenes? The full story is far more surprising than most fans realize. But what happened next would quietly shape one of the most talked-about relationships in rock history. Before the arguments, the headlines, and the lasting resentment, George Harrison was simply a young boy with a guitar and a dream. No one could have imagined that he would one day become part of the biggest band in the world, or that one personal conflict would stay with him for years. George Harrison was born on February 25, 1943, in Liverpool, England. He grew up in a working-class family where life was simple and money was often limited. His father, Harold Harrison, worked as a bus conductor, while his mother, Louise, spent years caring for the family before later working outside the home. They were not famous or wealthy, but they gave George a stable and supportive childhood. From an early age, George seemed quieter than most children around him. He was curious, thoughtful, and often preferred observing people instead of trying to become the center of attention. Friends later described him as calm, polite, and deeply interested in music. Everything changed when rock and roll arrived in Britain during the 1950s. Like many teenagers, George became fascinated by artists such as Elvis Presley and Carl Perkins. Their music opened a new world for him. He saved money, practiced for hours, and slowly taught himself how to play the guitar. That simple hobby soon led him to another teenager from Liverpool, Paul McCartney. Paul noticed George's talent even though he was younger than the others. According to many accounts from those close to the band, Paul introduced George to John Lennon, who was leading a local group called the Quarrymen. After proving his guitar skills during an informal audition, George became part of the group that would eventually become the Beatles. At first, George was the youngest member. John Lennon and Paul McCartney were already the main songwriters, and George often stayed in the background. He rarely demanded attention. Instead, he focused on improving his guitar playing and supporting the group's sound. But being the quiet member did not mean he lacked ambition. As the band grew, George wanted more opportunities to write songs. However, most albums were still dominated by Lennon and McCartney compositions. Several interviews over the years revealed that George sometimes felt creatively limited. He respected his bandmates, yet he also wanted his own voice to be heard. What do you think creates lasting success? Natural talent, relentless hard work, or being given the right opportunity at the right time? Share your thoughts in the comments. During the 1960s, Beatlemania exploded around the world. Fans screamed at concerts. Albums broke sales records. The band became a global cultural phenomenon unlike anything seen before. Yet behind the success, each member experienced fame differently. George often appeared uncomfortable with constant attention. While millions admired celebrity life, he increasingly searched for something deeper. He became interested in spirituality, meditation, and Indian culture. His friendship with Indian musician Ravi Shankar introduced him to the sitar and inspired a lifelong interest in Eastern philosophy. According to Harrison himself in later interviews, this spiritual journey became more meaningful to him than fame alone. As George matured, his confidence as a songwriter also grew. Songs like Taxman, While My Guitar Gently Weeps, and Something proved he was far more than just the band's lead guitarist. Critics and fellow musicians praised his writing, and many fans began seeing him in a completely new light. But success also brought pressure. Creative differences inside the band became harder to ignore. Personal lives grew more complicated. Every decision carried enormous weight because the entire world was watching. Most disagreements remained private, at least in the beginning. Few people outside the group's inner circle realized that small frustrations were slowly building beneath the surface. Respect was giving way to tension, and quiet disappointment was turning into something much more personal. No one knew it yet, but one relationship would eventually become so damaged that George Harrison would speak about it openly years later. The disagreement was no longer just about music. It became about trust, respect, and wounds that refused to heal. And the first real crack in that relationship came from a moment that seemed almost insignificant at the time. But the biggest problems rarely begin with one dramatic moment. They usually grow quietly, one disappointment at a time. For George Harrison, the relationship that would eventually become one of the most painful in his life did not collapse overnight. It slowly weakened through years of frustration, misunderstandings, and moments that left scars long after they happened. The man at the center of this story was Paul McCartney. That may surprise many fans. During the early years of the Beatles, Paul had actually helped George join the group. They had known each other as teenagers in Liverpool, and Paul recognized George's talent before many others did. But as the band's success grew, their working relationship became far more complicated. Paul was known for his perfectionism. Studio engineers, producers, and fellow musicians have often described him as someone who paid close attention to every musical detail. He wanted songs recorded a certain way, rehearsed repeatedly, and performed to the highest possible standard. That dedication helped make the Beatles one of the greatest bands in history. However, not everyone enjoyed working under that style. According to interviews George gave after the band's breakup, he increasingly felt that Paul could be controlling during recording sessions. George believed his musical ideas were sometimes dismissed before they had a fair chance. This did not mean Paul disliked George. Many historians of the band have pointed out that Paul was often trying to achieve the best possible recording, not intentionally hurt his bandmates. Still, good intentions do not always prevent damaged relationships. From George's perspective, he was growing into a respected songwriter while still being treated like the youngest member of the group. That frustration became even stronger after George began writing songs that critics now consider among the Beatles' finest work. Tracks like Something and Here Comes the Sun proved that George had developed into a songwriter capable of standing beside Lennon and McCartney. Yet album space remained limited, and Lennon-McCartney songs usually received priority. Imagine spending years improving your skills, finally creating some of your best work, only to feel that your voice still wasn't fully valued. That emotional weight continued building. The tension became impossible to hide during the recording sessions for the band's final projects. Publicly released footage from the Beatles' Get Back documentary shows several uncomfortable exchanges inside the studio. One famous moment captures George calmly telling Paul that he would play the guitar, "Whatever you want me to play, or I won't play at all." The sentence sounds polite, but beneath those words was years of disappointment. George was no longer arguing only about guitar parts. He was expressing how overlooked he felt. Eventually, the pressure became too much. In January 1969, George temporarily walked out of the band. For several days, the Beatles continued without him, while wondering whether he would ever return. His departure shocked the others. It forced everyone to recognize that the problems inside the group had become serious. Although George eventually came back after private discussions, the relationship had changed forever. The trust that once existed was becoming increasingly difficult to rebuild. If you enjoy discovering the hidden stories behind music legends and the moments that changed history forever, consider subscribing. Some of the greatest stories in entertainment happened far away from the stage lights. Even after the Beatles officially broke up in 1970, the emotional distance between George and Paul did not disappear overnight. George later spoke honestly in interviews about feeling creatively restricted during those years. In his 1980 autobiography, I Me Mine, and in later conversations, he reflected on those frustrations, though his views also softened with time. Paul, for his part, has acknowledged that he could be demanding in the studio, and has said that he later came to appreciate George's extraordinary growth as both a songwriter and guitarist. Their story was never a simple tale of heroes and villains. It was the story of two brilliant musicians with different personalities, different creative styles, and different ways of dealing with pressure. Still, there was one incident after the breakup that made their relationship even colder. It involved public comments, painful memories, and feelings that neither man could easily forget. And what happened next would convince many fans that George's resentment had reached its deepest point. But just when it seemed George Harrison had finally stepped out of the Beatles' shadow, another emotional battle was beginning. Instead of bringing old friends closer together, success after the band's breakup often highlighted the differences that had been growing for years. And in George's eyes, some wounds were proving much harder to heal than anyone expected. When the Beatles officially split in 1970, many people wondered whether George Harrison could succeed on his own. For years, he had lived in the shadow of John Lennon and Paul McCartney, whose songwriting partnership had dominated the band's albums. George answered those doubts almost immediately. In late 1970, he released the triple album All Things Must Pass. It became a massive commercial and critical success. Songs like My Sweet Lord and What Is Life showed the world that George had been storing away years of creative ideas that had rarely found room on Beatles records. To many fans, the album felt like proof that George's talent had always been underestimated. The success also carried a personal message. George no longer needed to compete for space on an album. He could finally express himself without waiting for approval from anyone else. Then, in 1971, George organized the concert for Bangladesh, one of the first major charity concerts in modern music history. Featuring several famous musicians, the event raised global awareness and funds for people suffering during the humanitarian crisis in Bangladesh. It showed another side of George. While others measured success through awards and sales, George increasingly focused on using music to help others. Yet despite these achievements, questions about the Beatles never disappeared. Journalists constantly asked him about the breakup. Fans wanted to know who was responsible. Every interview seemed to reopen old memories. George answered honestly, but his comments often reflected lingering disappointment. He spoke about feeling creatively limited during his Beatles years and suggested that working relationships inside the band had sometimes become frustrating. These remarks were widely reported, leading many people to believe that George's relationship with Paul remained especially strained. Paul, meanwhile, was building his own successful career with Wings. Like George, he was proving that life after the Beatles could still include hit records and sold-out concerts. Yet public comparisons between the two never stopped. Every new album, interview, or appearance was analyzed by fans looking for signs of tension. Sometimes, even innocent comments became headlines. Over time, however, something important also began to happen. The anger that had once dominated the story slowly became more complicated. According to several interviews from the 1980s and 1990s, George admitted that growing older had changed his perspective. While he did not erase the past or deny the disagreements, he also recognized that fame, pressure, and constant public attention had affected everyone differently. Paul expressed similar thoughts in later years, acknowledging that he could be demanding during recording sessions and saying he wished he had appreciated George's songwriting even more while they were together. That did not erase the pain, but it suggested that neither man wanted history to remember only the conflict. Everyone experiences moments when they feel unheard or underestimated. Maybe you've faced a time when your hard work wasn't fully recognized. Those moments can shape a person for years, but they can also become the beginning of something greater. Still, one event reminded the world just how fragile old relationships could be. When George was asked in interviews about the Beatles' final years, he sometimes returned to the same feelings of frustration. Those honest reflections fueled the belief that Paul had been the person George struggled with most. But history is rarely that simple. George also shared warm memories of Paul at different times, praised his musical gifts, and acknowledged the incredible journey they had shared from Liverpool to global superstardom. Their relationship was filled with contradictions: friendship, rivalry, admiration, disappointment, and mutual respect. It was never a story of pure hatred. Instead, it was the story of two extraordinary artists whose personalities often clashed under unimaginable pressure. And as George's life moved into its later years, another chapter would reveal that legacy is often more powerful than conflict. Because in the end, what George chose to leave behind mattered far more than the arguments that once made headlines. But even after the music changed the world, George Harrison discovered that fame could never protect a person from pain. Behind the awards, sold-out concerts, and legendary status was a man carrying emotional scars, health struggles, and deeply personal challenges that few fans fully understood. The conflict with Paul McCartney was only one part of a much larger story. By the mid-1970s, George had everything many people dream about. He was wealthy, respected, and recognized across the globe. Yet in interviews, he often spoke about how fame itself had never made him truly happy. Unlike many rock stars of his era, George became increasingly focused on spirituality rather than celebrity. His lifelong interest in Indian philosophy, meditation, and the teachings he explored with Ravi Shankar shaped how he viewed success. He believed that money and fame were temporary, while inner peace mattered far more. Still, his personal life was far from peaceful. George's marriage to Pattie Boyd eventually came to an end. Their relationship had already been under strain, and the situation became even more complicated because Pattie later married George's close friend, Eric Clapton. Although the circumstances were painful, George later showed remarkable maturity. Over time, he rebuilt a friendship with Clapton, demonstrating that forgiveness was possible, even after deep personal hurt. Then came one of the most frightening moments of his life. On December 30th, 1999, an intruder broke into George's home, Friar Park, and attacked him with a knife. George suffered multiple stab wounds and a collapsed lung. His wife, Olivia Harisson, bravely fought the attacker, helping save George's life until emergency services arrived. The shocking incident reminded the world that even global icons are vulnerable. Although George survived, the attack had a lasting impact on his physical and emotional well-being. Around the same period, George was also facing serious health problems. After years of smoking, he was diagnosed with cancer. He underwent treatment and continued fighting the illness with the quiet determination that had defined much of his life. Despite these hardships, George rarely sought public sympathy. Instead, he continued making music, spending time with family, and focusing on the spiritual beliefs that had guided him for decades. Meanwhile, the relationship with Paul McCartney slowly became less defined by conflict. As the years passed, both men appeared to gain greater perspective. While George never hid his frustrations about certain Beatles memories, he also spoke respectfully about Paul's extraordinary musical abilities. Likewise, Paul increasingly praised George's songwriting, calling songs like Something among the greatest ever written. Many fans who once believed the two men could never move beyond their disagreements began to see a more balanced picture. Yes, there had been real conflict. Yes, there had been years of frustration. But there was also shared history that could never be erased. They had changed music forever together. That truth remains stronger than any argument. Everyone carries disagreements that seem impossible to resolve. Sometimes time doesn't erase the past, but it changes how we understand it. Looking back with honesty can be just as powerful as winning an argument. Sadly, George's health continued to decline. On November 29, 2001, George Harrison passed away at the age of 58 after battling cancer. His death marked the end of a remarkable life that had influenced generations of musicians and fans around the world. Tributes poured in from every corner of the music industry. Among those paying tribute was Paul McCartney, who spoke warmly of George, describing him as a dear friend and an incredibly talented musician. Whatever disagreements had existed, Paul's public words reflected respect, admiration, and sadness at the loss of someone with whom he had shared an unforgettable journey. The story that once seemed to be about hatred was beginning to look very different, because beneath the headlines, there was another truth waiting to be understood. And that truth becomes even clearer when we look at the legacy George Harrison left behind, one that reached far beyond music, fame, or old rivalries. But George Harrison's greatest achievements were not measured only by hit songs or record sales. Long after proving himself as one of the world's finest musicians, he quietly built a legacy that stretched into business, filmmaking, charity, and spiritual influence. It was an empire unlike that of most celebrities, one driven less by fame and more by purpose. By the late 1970s, George had already earned millions from his years with the Beatles and from his successful solo career. But instead of chasing a lavish public lifestyle, he often invested in projects that genuinely interested him. One of the most surprising examples came in 1978. George helped create handmade films, a production company that would unexpectedly change British cinema. According to those involved, George decided to finance the comedy film Life of Brian after other investors pulled out over concerns about its controversial subject matter. He reportedly mortgaged part of his own property to help make the film possible. Many people later described it as one of the most expensive cinema tickets ever purchased because George simply wanted to see the movie made. The gamble paid off. Life of Brian became a commercial success, and Handmade Films went on to produce several respected British movies during the following years. George had quietly become more than a musician. He was now an important supporter of independent filmmaking. His business decisions reflected his personality. He rarely invested just to increase his wealth. Instead, he backed ideas and creative projects that he personally believed in. George also remained deeply committed to charity. The Concert for Bangladesh, organized in 1971 alongside Ravi Shankar, became a landmark event in music history. It demonstrated that globally famous artists could use their influence to respond to humanitarian crises. Many later charity concerts, including Live Aid, were inspired by the model George helped establish. Although financial and legal issues delayed the distribution of some of the Bangladesh funds, public records show that the concert raised significant awareness and millions of dollars for relief efforts over time. More importantly, it changed how the music industry viewed philanthropy. George's influence also extended into publishing, music rights, and collaborations with other artists. His songs continued generating royalties decades after their release, ensuring that his work reached new generations of listeners. Yet unlike many celebrities, George rarely spoke about money. Friends often described him as someone far more interested in conversations about music, spirituality, gardening, or family than in discussing business success. His home, Friar Park, reflected that outlook. The historic estate became a peaceful retreat where he spent much of his later life, away from constant media attention. He enjoyed restoring its gardens, walking the grounds, and living a quieter existence than most global superstars. Today, George Harrison's estate continues to manage his musical catalog, creative works, and legacy through his family. His songs remain among the most celebrated in rock history, and his influence can still be heard in artists across multiple generations. Looking back, it becomes clear that George built an empire based on creativity rather than publicity. He proved that success could mean more than wealth. It could mean creating timeless music, supporting meaningful causes, helping others tell their stories, and leaving the world a little better than he found it. As new documentaries, books, and interviews continue to explore his life, one message appears again and again. George Harrison was never trying to become the loudest voice in the room. He simply wanted the freedom to be heard. That quiet determination became one of his greatest strengths. But before we close this remarkable journey, there is one final lesson hidden inside George Harrison's life. A lesson that explains why millions continue to admire him decades after his passing. Because in the end, people rarely remember the arguments. They remember the impact. But the most surprising part of George Harrison's story is not who he argued with. It is how he chose to be remembered. For decades, headlines focused on tension inside the Beatles. Yet when we step back and look at his entire life, those conflicts become only a small chapter in a much bigger legacy. George Harrison passed away on November 29, 2001, at the age of 58 after battling cancer. News of his death shocked millions of fans around the world. Tributes came from musicians, actors, political leaders, and ordinary people whose lives had been touched by his music. One message stood out. Paul McCartney publicly honored George as a friend and one of the finest musicians he had ever known. Ringo Starr also paid emotional tribute, remembering George's kindness, humor, and loyalty. Those words reminded the world that real life is rarely as simple as newspaper headlines. Yes, George had spoken openly about frustrations with Paul over the years. In interviews and in his autobiography, I Me Mine, he described feeling creatively overlooked during parts of his Beatles career. Those feelings were genuine and well documented. But there is no verified evidence that George Harrison ever said he hated Paul McCartney more than anyone. That idea has become popular in online videos, blogs, and social media posts because it creates dramatic headlines. However, the historical record tells a more balanced story. George criticized Paul's controlling approach in the recording studio. He disagreed with many creative decisions. He admitted that working together had often been difficult. At the same time, he also praised Paul's musical brilliance on multiple occasions. Likewise, Paul repeatedly described George as a gifted songwriter and acknowledged that he had not fully appreciated George's talent during the Beatles' years. Their relationship was complicated. It included friendship, competition, respect, disappointment, and eventually reconciliation in many ways. That complexity makes their story far more human than a simple narrative of hatred. George's greatest legacy was never built on conflict. It was built on music that continues to inspire generations. Songs like Something, Here Comes the Sun, and My Sweet Lord remain among the most loved recordings in popular music. Young listeners continue discovering his work decades after it was first released. His influence extends far beyond songwriting. Artists still study his guitar playing. Musicians continue exploring the spiritual themes he introduced into popular music. Filmmakers remember his support for independent cinema through handmade films. Humanitarian organizations continue recognizing the lasting impact of the Concert for Bangladesh, which helped establish the modern benefit concert as a powerful fundraising model. George also left behind another lesson. Success does not erase personal struggles. Even global icons experience rejection. Even legends feel overlooked. Even the world's most famous musicians carry emotional wounds that the public cannot always see. Perhaps that is why George Harrison's story continues to resonate. He was not perfect, neither were the people around him. Yet together, they created music that changed history forever. If George Harrison's journey taught us anything, it is that true greatness is not measured by how many arguments you win. It is measured by what you leave behind for the world. And maybe that lesson applies to all of us. One day, people may not remember every disagreement we had or every mistake we made, but they will remember how we treated others, what we created, and the difference we made. Thank you for watching. If this story changed the way you see George Harrison, let us know in the comments. And if you enjoy uncovering the true stories behind legendary musicians, subscribe and join us for the next documentary, because another famous life hides an equally surprising truth.